Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rashid Masavin. I am the Dean of College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences here at Texas Southern University, and I am delighted to celebrate with you for the next hour or so with a very special program for the Black History Month with Dr. Clark. So I would like to take a few minutes to introduce Dr. Clark to you. I won't be able to talk about all of his accomplishments. That'll take the entire hour that we have together. But let me briefly introduce to you our esteemed colleague and speaker for the evening. Dr. Clark is an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacotherapeutics and Clinical Research and Director of Experiential Education and Pharmacy Residency Programs at the University of South Florida College of Pharmacy in Tampa. Dr. Clark earned his BS in Pharmacy from Texas Southern University. Yes, you heard me, Texas Southern University. He is an alum of our school. He then continued on and received a PharmD degree from Florida A&M. He then earned a master's degree in pharmaceutical administration from Wayne State in Detroit and completed his residency training in Detroit General Hospital. As past president of the Association of Black Health System Pharmacists, ABHP, Dr. Clark has played an instrumental role in the organization's influence on minority health issues, including the creation of the ABHP Research and Education Foundation. In 2005, Dr. Clark led an effort to increase collaboration between ABHP and ASHP on matters of mutual interest, including reducing health disparities and increasing ethnic and cultural diversity in the workplace. The partnership resulted in a series of educational sessions at ASHP Media Clinical Meeting and the development of the Joint Leadership Award. Dr. Clark, it is truly a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. And really, I'm just honored to be able to come and talk with you about an area that has become a big passion for me. I have been focusing on African American pharmacy history now for a couple of years. At the university, as you know, we all have to have some kind of research area that we're looking at. I sort of chose history not by plan. It started pretty much by a question from a student, actually, and that student was asking me this question back in 2013 or so. Who was the first African-American woman to get a pharmacy degree? And I had no idea who that was, but it just struck me very, very strongly to really look. And I started looking, and I couldn't find the person. And I continued to look and couldn't find the lady. And I kept looking and looking, and I still couldn't find her. Then I found all of these internet announcements of who was the first African-American female pharmacist, and I have since learned that all of that information that showed up that's still on the internet is really not accurate. And I'll share with you in a moment who that person I believe is, who was the first. That's kind of what got me started. So I really have about two overviews because it's really more than this. And this project is such a huge undertaking, and to me a very, very important thing for pharmacists. Throughout one of the top areas of history has always been medicine, has been science, and anything around health. There have been much attention drawn to physicians, there's much attention drawn to nurses. It continues today, but as you really look at the amount of attention drawn to pharmacists, in particular African American pharmacists, it is treated almost as if it's not as important as physicians, as almost as if it was insignificant. And you really get that feeling once you start doing the research on it, because you won't find the information as easily as you would find in the other areas. It actually, in a way, motivates me even more to get this information out and get it into the literature where it really belongs, as a learning experience for not only our students, but for pharmacists who have been around, who have never been acknowledged. It really creates a real passion for me to try to make that point. And it is really so bad, I can tell you. And I really welcome, and part of my goal too is to stimulate people to really look at this area. This is probably one of the most fertile areas in the history of pharmacy that you're going to find. It's truly a niche, and that's not no joke. It's truly a niche right now. That's the reason I jumped on it, because it's nothing there that you think should be there based on the way we treat history in pharmacy. So this is going to be my niche area for the rest of my life. And I welcome anyone else to join in on this, as well as try to stimulate people to really get the same interest, because it is so big and there's so much that we have not, that I have not uncovered. But one good thing about looking at it, you always see, you may have one objective and one thing you're looking for, you're going to always see a number of sidebars, a number of different directions you can go in. So it's almost endless, and it's information that really needs to be put into the history books. Yesterday, I was looking at going to the International Conference on Pharmacy History. There was not one presentation in that conference that had anything to do with African American history. Even the ones in this country are the same way. You just don't see it. They're in the process of reviewing Glenn Sonnerdecker's book on the history of pharmacy. Now, that book has been revised. It was the book that I was taught when I was in pharmacy school, and it's still being revised again in the next year or so. There's not one single paragraph, not one single chapter on African American pharmacy. So I said, after all of these revisions, how could that be? How could not one person be mentioned in that textbook? So I think it's going to change this year, because we made an effort to try to get the writers and the people who are reproducing it to actually change that textbook for the first time. So that's what drives me with this whole project. So when I started looking for the women, I couldn't find them. So I made a simple little deducement that if I'm going to find those women and they have gotten a degree in pharmacy, they must have went to some school. So I started looking, and then I did not realize that we had these 9 Black pharmacy schools that was started right after the Civil War. I never knew that existed. So then a little light went off in my head, and I said, well, that's where they gotta be. They gotta be there. So let me spend the time trying to find those schools. And guess what? Just like I just described, I went to the National Library of Medicine, which is a division of the Library of Congress, and they didn't have the records. And I just sort of yelled and screamed, why don't you have the records? I mean, you're the Library of Congress and you don't have the records for these Black schools. Well, I become friends with Dr. Stephen Greenberg. Incredible man. He's like a walking library himself. And he told me that I have a few files on 3 of the schools. And that just lit me up like a tree, because I was like, oh my gosh, he actually found 3 of the schools. So and they were on microfiche. This is another challenge. So he said, don't worry, I got a way I can send those things through your school's library. So he sent me the Louisville National Medical College Department of Pharmacy, the University of Tennessee, the University of West Tennessee College of Pharmacy, and he also sent me the New Orleans University Flint Medical College of Pharmacy. And I was just delighted. But then, lo and behold, when you go through the records, my goal at the time was to identify the faculty. I wanted to identify the curriculum. I wanted to know who were those students. I needed to see how many graduated. And guess what? When you finally get the records, you get pieces of the records. So University of West Tennessee, which was open for 23 years, I only found 2 years through the Library of Congress of their records. So I can only profile the 1903 class, and I can profile the 1909 class. And I have to make deducements and assumptions and things of that nature about the other class years. The same thing with the Louisville College. It has it started in 1889, but there's only about 3 years worth of records that you can really locate. So, and in those records, my goal was always to get the names of those students, list those students somewhere, try to learn who they were, try to learn what they've done. And I had a biographical outline that I still use now to try to write their story. And again, you have difficulty finding those names. So what I started to doing is going through a number of records. I went through I tried to look at as many annual catalogs, announcements, yearbooks, starting with 1868, which was when Howard University started. And I tried to go from there as far ahead as I could. And that meant looking at catalogs, announcements, yearbooks, anything that I could find that would allow me to achieve the objective that I was trying to achieve and trying to profile these historical Black events for Black pharmacists. So I ended up looking at Meharry Pharmaceutical College, the Shaw Leonard School of Pharmacy, University of West Tennessee, the Flint Medical College of Pharmacy in New Orleans. And I just found one in this past December 2020, the Freeland-Hassan University School of Pharmacy. It's a Black school. I've never heard of it. I just happened to be doing research in one of their old journals, and I saw it mentioned in there. And I went and started digging up things, and I found that there was another Black school I didn't know about, the Freeland-Hassan University School of Pharmacy. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, because it was a night school. And then there was the Louisville National Medical College. So again, my whole objective was to get as much data so I can describe those schools. That meant admission requirements, graduation requirements, much of the curriculum that I could kind of outline, the length of the programs, the degrees that they offered, the faculty. I wanted to know who were the faculty, what kind of degrees that they have, and I really wanted to get the students. I wanted to know who attended those schools and what year they graduate and what grade they get. And then when I first tried to publish it, I got a lot of pushback, and the publishers were saying, we need you to compare these Black schools to white schools. That was not my intent. I never wanted to do that. But it really frustrates you when you know that you got your own objective of what you want to publish, and somebody tells you to publish something different. So that in itself is another 20 years worth of work to do that. So I said, I'm not going to do it. So then I continued in the direction that I'm going with it, and I did find another one I'll share with you. So I'm not a trained historian, and I'm not an archivist. I'm not trained in library sciences, so I don't have a PhD in those areas. And that does make a difference. So what you have, once you get into this type of research, if you don't intend to go back to school and get a training in those areas, then you got to learn how to do it yourself. You got to learn your own methods, and you build some other tools and techniques by collaborating with other real historians and archivists who you can kind of convince to take an interest in what you're trying to do. So what you have here is a list of things that I use. I use a HathiTrust, some people pronounce it HathiTrust Digital Library, and I can tell you what you can use that for, and you go there when you're looking for certain things. That's where you're going to find all of these catalogs. You're going to find them there, and I use that to validate when a degree. Like if I find someone, I read somewhere in another document that says that person has a PharmD, a Doctor of Pharmacy degree, I don't just assume that that's correct. I want to go and find the actual catalog. If I can find the commencement booklet, if I can find the graduation list, I document all of that. I save it all in a file. I copy it all. And when I make a reference to a pharmacist degree, everyone that I have mentioned, I always have a way to validate that it is the degree that they received. The Drug Circular and Chemical Gazette, those are those old journals that has things like the year that they may have passed the board exam or passed the board exam. You will find those items in newsletter type formats. They're also in the pharmaceutical era. And whenever I try to describe the person, once I can find them, I start with with building a family portrait of them. I start with the ancestry site, and I make sure that I know who their father is, who their mother is, what the occupation of the dad, how many siblings they had in the family, what was the occupation of the sibling, what was the school they went to, And then I get down to things like accomplishments, and those things may be located somewhere else. And so people ask me, I can sit there and tell a story on a pharmacist, and they'll say, how did you know that? How did you know what the father did? And how did you know what the father's work and occupation was? That's because I build the family tree first, and then I'll work from there down to the other parts. And I always want photos. I try to find a photo on everything to really make it enhance it. One account that I use is e-yearbooks. And it normally will have, if you can find, if the schools have kept good tracks of all of their graduation records, you can usually find a photo there. Now, it's not like you can go there and put a name in the search function and it pops up. Sometimes you got to go page by page by page to find it. A few weeks ago, I got excited. I was looking at Alice Augusta Ball. She's the first pharmacist that discovered the cure for leprosy. And as I'm reading through it, she went to the University of Washington in Seattle, and I read where her dad was a lawyer and her grandfather was a very famous person, and that she went to this little high school in Washington. Now, I grew up in the South, in the segregated South at the time. This was 1903. And I said to myself, what high school could she have gone to in 1903 that wasn't like, I was thinking of myself, that wasn't like segregation in the South? And I decided to go to e-yearbooks. And this was just out of a question in my brain. Would I find her high school photo? And I got excited because I actually found her 1903 high school photo. And that just blew my mind because I never thought I would find that. So that you find those, I found that by looking through e-yearbooks. So now I realize that if they're depending on the school, you can actually go back as far as the early 1900s to look up a high school photo. And so then newspapers.com is just invaluable for what you can do there with that account. Crisis Magazine is the reason that on my radar is because that magazine published an annual issue of all the Black graduates from pharmacy school, medical schools, mostly professional schools, going back to about 1918 up to about 1940. So I go there to look for photos and look for to validate certain graduation records. And the Who's Who series, there's about 3 of those, and that's one of the other sources that I look at to try to gather biographical information as well as photos. I have nothing to disclose in this presentation. This is strictly a work of interest of mine. There's the use of certain words that I wanted to highlight that comes through really the research, and those words are really the N word. So you're going to see Negro mostly published quite a lot, and in some cases words like negress, and you may find some words like colored and all that. That is how we were portrayed as African Americans during that time. I don't in any way intend to offend anyone by the use of those words. It just basically is coming from the nature of the times at which those words were used at the time, and even the titles on research reports and all those things may be cited in the same way, and that's why I use it. And when I'm using those words, it's usually also meant the same as we may see it as African American. Women in pharmacy has been increasing for years, and this is nothing new. We all know that for years, to the point that they now dominate the type of pharmacists in America now. And it was projected in 2020 from an old slide that we would be at 62%, and that was before we had all of these new schools opening. So we hit 62% long before 2020, and that's the only point I want to make there. But the historical reality about it is that women have not always been present in large numbers. Their slow rise over time have come with a lot of resistance. It has come with questions of whether or not they should even have a role in pharmacy, and these was hardline types of attitudes, whether they should even be allowed to enter the profession, to even own a store. And one of the first big protests that continues today had to do with work schedules. Women were once not allowed to work on weekends, they could not work at night, and they always had to work part-time. And that was a big protest back around the 1840s and 1860s. And believe it or not, it probably still is today. They were not allowed to work in technical laboratories. I think now if you go in any laboratory today, you're going to see mostly women looking under the microscopes. But back in those days, you were not allowed to be in the technical laboratories. When I joined Kappa Psi at Texas Southern, we were all men. It was if women were not allowed to be in the fraternity. It didn't accept women. So, but today that has all changed, as you know. Kappa Psi is male, is co-ed now. So is Kappa Epsilon, but years ago, as even in my time, it was women were not allowed in those fraternities. They had to have their own separate sorority. Then also, they were not even allowed to teach on faculty. And I think this comes from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. That was the very first school of pharmacy in America around 1836, with this group of men who got together and formed this. It was not a college of pharmacy the way we see it. That was the name of the organization, which was a group of men who got together and decided that they were going to come up with a school to teach people more formal education and training to avoid all of these other people doing work of a pharmacist without going to school. This is just an article from the Drug Circular, which was printed in 1896. And I won't read the entire article, but it's really pointing out the attitudes toward women in that I'll just paraphrase it sort of simply here, that this was an article basically comparing a woman in pharmacy to a housekeeper. Basically what they thought was that she should only be cleaning up the utensils and the instruments that are used in the compounding of medication, but not be a woman. Said if she cannot be a new woman, a summer girl, or a society star. And I'm not sure what that means, but I think that's like being some type of liberated woman. You cannot be that and be a pharmacist. So that was how that came. That's an 1896 article from Drug Circular. Now, the reason I mentioned PCP being a group that may have started that trend towards women not being part of a faculty was when back in 1883, a lady named Susan Hayhurst, who had went to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. She graduated in 1867. She had a strong interest in chemistry. So maybe because the men knew that she was already a doctor, they allowed her to sit in the classes that were being held by the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. So she sat there every day, every class meeting, learning about pharmacy for 2 years. And then she ended up getting her PhD degree. And in 1883, she became the first woman to get first known woman to receive a pharmacy degree from a school in America. And so, but it didn't change anything, that they still continue to have difficulty. Certain states would not allow them to get licensed. Women began to come together as a group. They formed their own professional association. And so but she did stimulate other women to go into pharmacy school. And it also came from from certain things like the women movement that was advocating for women to get educated. So the number, by 1899, it had hit around 290 women. The first big change and first big pattern of an increase in women integrating into pharmacy occurred between 1920 and 1930. It went from 33.9% in 1920 up to 10.2% by 1930. So that was one of the time periods when the change first started to begin to be seen. African American women, on the other hand, had a completely different experience. Up until prior to 1865, they were mostly in slavery. There may have been a few that had gone through apothecary programs that was considered in some cases as a formal training program. Today, when we speak of formal education, we mean college education, college training. But there was also a formal education process to become an apothecary. I have not found any except one in Louisiana that was also a minister of a church, but she was also considered a pharmacist. Most African American women came right out of slavery, right after 1865. They had no father who owned a store like other women who could transfer that business over to the daughter when they passed away, or a husband or a brother that could do that. They had no support from the churches and the communities. That later came in the early 1890s, but right after slavery, that was prior to the end of the Civil War, that was not occurring, and they definitely could not travel. So I won't go through every stage of this slide. The point that I want to make here is that there was an act by Senator Justin Morrow called the Morrow Act of 1862, which was prior to the end of the Civil War, where they was given land to start what we call now land grant colleges and universities. So that law that was passed then was where they started. One thing that's not mentioned about that mostly is that law had a clause in it that promoted the education of women. And so women began to take advantage of that by going to those schools, but it also had no clause in it to prevent them from embracing what we call the separate but equal doctrine, which means they don't have to admit Black people. They can decide that they don't want them there because that was not blocked in the law. So at the end of the Civil War, also during that, when that was implemented, it was during the Civil War. So the schools in the states in the South were not allowed to benefit from that land grant law, because they were disqualified by virtue of they were considered trying to overthrow the government. So they were disqualified. So at the end of the Civil War, that law was amended in 1890, became the Morrow Land Grant College Act. They no longer gave land to establish land grant colleges, they gave grants. So that's why we have the name land grant. It was started in 1890. At that point, the southern states were allowed to benefit from that, but they did not, embrace the separate but equal doctrine and would not allow Blacks to come to the schools. So what happened there was the start of what we call today your HBCUs. And so that's the significance of that law in very general terms. That also, through that period, we had the formation of Howard University, we had the Harriet Pharmaceutical College, and Shaw Leonard School of Pharmacy also started during that time period. Some other problems that was occurring with Black women trying to get an education is that they were oftentimes not treated with any trust even after they had gotten their education, and oftentimes could not get employed. Black men could get jobs, but women had a much more difficult time because they had to deal with the two big factors of sexism and racism. And so they were oftentimes not allowed to work in a pharmacy. They were often being criticized by the store owners, and then in general, the employer feared that they're going to lose money if they put a Black person in the store, so they would not allow them to be employed. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a reference there. It's called The Negro in Pharmacy. That was published in the Drug Circle and Chemical Gazette in 1897. That is a flagship article. That was the very first article published on Black pharmacists, the very first one. So that list of 6 things you see on the slide came right out of that article. It's not me just paraphrasing it and making it up. You can read the article, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's not an interview of the Black. In a way, you can almost look at it as an interview of Black pharmacists, because they are making references to the experience of certain Black pharmacists who have been cited in that article. Incredible article. I keep about 2 copies that are around all the time because it's the very first one. This is another article taken from the Bulletin of Pharmacy in 1900. The title is A Negress in Pharmacy. And they are referring here to a woman. And that woman is Julia Pearl Hughes, who many of you probably know who that is. And what's significant about this article, once you get past that derogatory name, is that the content of the article provides you some very, very important information. One thing that it points out here is that she was the first woman to own a drugstore in Philadelphia. And also, At this point, she was considered the first woman to own a drugstore in America. So wow, boom, we got a hot piece of information there. So that you probably won't find anywhere else but that reference to, other than a statement about it. But where it came from is from this article. It also states that she was from North Carolina. She graduated from Howard. If you go back to that first article that I mentioned about the Negro in pharmacy, they interviewed Julia Hughes in that article. Her interview is actually written out in a quote in that article. What I found from her interview is that she tells a story about why she went into pharmacy as a woman. That's very, very important when it comes to teaching this story about African-American women in pharmacy and what she went through to try to get into pharmacy school. She first applied at Shaw Leonard, and I'll tell you later, Shaw Leonard was a school that was a black school, but it had a very strong religious type of foundation. They really did not treat women very well. That started from the medical school. The medical school rarely accepted a woman into med school, so some of that carried over into the pharmacy school. She got rejected. And if you read the article, her interview, you'll see where she said that they would not accept her into the school. A black woman trying to get into a black school, she got rejected. So she ended up going to Howard. That's how she ended up at Howard. So she graduated in 1867. At that time, she was one of only the first woman with a pharmacy degree to graduate from Howard, but not the first woman to graduate from Howard. One had graduated before her that did not finish some of her requirements, so they gave her a certificate rather than a degree. So we count her as one of the graduates, but she didn't have a degree. Her name was Susan Peters. So the other bit of information about the article is that when she was offered a job at the Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, but what it doesn't tell you, she was offered a job as the manager of that pharmacy. That's almost equivalent to a director of pharmacy. So technically, she was probably the first woman to be employed as a pharmacy director in a hospital. And so that was 1899, and she got that position because she also served an internship while she was going to school at the Freedman Hospital in Washington, D.C. There was a recommendation made by someone there to the medical director, Frederick Douglass, that allowed her to be offered that position. And so that was, although this article has makes you raise your eyebrows, it really is providing some really good information. And I mentioned about the Land-Grant Act, I won't talk about that, but from that time period, there were 9 pharmacy schools that were formed just for training African Americans between 1868 and 1927. And I will go over those, I will share those names with you in a moment. These are 6 of the schools that were formed that are closed. And so that included by year that they opened. So the one that opened first here was Shaw Leonard. Meharry opened the year after. Then about a year after that, University of West Tennessee and University of New Orleans opened. And then the others, Louisville National, Freeland Hospital, and Washington College of Pharmacy, which is not Howard University. So that's the one that I have had difficulty finding. And I've also worked with the National Library of Medicine. We cannot find Washington College. I can find graduates from the school, so I do know that it probably did exist, but there's no graduates. The only 2 that was existing after they closed, and the last one to close was Meharry, which was the last class graduated in 1936. And so after that, there was only 2 schools left open that trained African-American pharmacists, and that was Howard and Xavier. Xavier was just getting started, so their graduation numbers were very low. They were only putting out about 4 to 5 students per year. And Howard had not revved up their numbers either. They were still only graduating about 10 students. So when Dr. Chauncey Cooper presented his classic report, he had mentioned in his report there was less than 20 graduates a year in 1947 coming out of in the United States. And I can't find that number, but I'm pretty close to agreeing with him because I have the numbers from Howard. I have the numbers from Xavier. I got the actual numbers in those years. And they were running between 14 and 21 graduates. So he's right on the money. They were not producing any pharmacists at that point. So then that led to an impact on healthcare because we didn't have the black pharmacists to serve the community there. And at that same time, those white stores were not doing the duties that we would expect to the customers. So that had a major impact on healthcare during that time. And that's what I'm writing about that now in a document. I'm going to try to publish that this year. That had a big, profound effect on the South. The red area you see on the slide is what is referred to as the Black Belt. That's where over 50% of the African Americans lived between 1870 and up until the 1960s. It's not called the Black Belt because it had all the African Americans there. It's referred to as a Black Belt because of the soil. It was dark in color, not the people. So I want to make that clear. But that's also the area where all the schools that were formed. Well, I'm sorry, that's where four of the schools were formed and forced to close were located in that area. That's the point I'm trying to make about that. It had a profound impact on that part of the country because they shut those schools down. That was not only pharmacy schools, but they also closed the medical schools as well. So that had a very big impact. And I just mentioned that a moment ago. This is just another slide. But the only point there was that by 1910, there was 9.8 million African Americans living in that area. So that's a big number to have a sort of a restriction on or their inability to get access to health care. So I want to briefly go through some of those schools. I can't go through the details. It's just way too much information. So I'm only going to touch on a few points, but would really appreciate any question that you may have. Meharry was started by the Meharry brothers. They really wanted to do a lot to try to improve the life of Black people after slavery. So they formed that school in 1890. These are just some numbers. I was able to get almost these exact numbers, all the numbers from Meharry. Their records are very, very complete. I don't think they're missing a year since it opened. And so these are pretty close numbers. The only difference that I would tell you that maybe in these numbers is that I took these from the catalogs. When you talk to the archivists at the library at Meharry, they use the catalogs and the commencement booklets. Now, I did not use the commencement booklets. So I may be off by one or two numbers, but not by very much. So their peak enrollment occurred between 1914 and 1925. So right around 1928, their enrollment started to decline. It went through a big dive, and it wouldn't slow down. So by the time it hit 1930, by the beginning of the 1935 session, they made an announcement that prior to that year, which had been probably the spring of 35, that if they didn't get 20 students coming into the freshman class for that 35-36 session, they were going to close the school. And so then they didn't get the numbers. So when the last class graduated in 1936, started in the 35 session, ended in the spring of 36, and they only had 4 students in that class. They went from having about 40 students per class graduating to down to 4, and the school the pharmacy program never reopened after 1936. These blue bars here are really the numbers of the women that were graduating from that school. They started with 3 women in 1894, and from now they had a very small number of women graduating, and they never got up more than 5 women per class up until 1913. I didn't take this all the way out to 36, but as you go out to 1936, the numbers actually do go up a little higher. I stopped it at that point because I wanted to I found the lady I was looking for, by the way. She's in that group on the far left of the screen in that 1894 class. That's where I found her at. So by the time the school closed, it had graduated over 560. Now, the archivist tells me it was 600, but I can't validate 600 graduates. I can count everyone from the records that I have, and I got about 564. And out of that total, 83 of those were women. So they had about 15% of that class were women. They graduated the highest number of African-American women out of all the schools. And Howard may debate that. But I also got, they just published the book. I don't know if you can see this book, but This is the book Howard just came out with 2 years ago. It has every one of Howard graduates listed in the book. So I decided to count them by myself. I hand counted them. I counted about 79. So when they tell me Howard had the number, I don't think so. I think it was my Harry. My Harry had at least 83. I counted those, hand counted them myself. When they graduated, I was able to get their, my Harry kept a record of where the graduates went, which is very, very nice. So this was the distribution of the graduates from 1891 to 1931. So the light colored area on the slide shows the states that they went into. But as you can see, they really fulfilled the goal that they were trying to achieve in terms of making healthcare providers be available in the South. I don't know the percentage there, but that percentage is very high in terms of the graduates that actually stayed in the South. Most of them were in Tennessee, where the school was located. The second place that they were at was Texas. So they had the high, those are the places where the highest two numbers were at. And that's why you find some of the very first pharmacists, African-American pharmacists, were set up programs in Texas. And that's and most likely, and I don't know that for sure, but most likely they were Meharry graduates by that time. So this is one slide that at least raised that suspicion. This is a lady I found. I was so excited to find her photo, even though I found her name. And this is Matilda Lloyd. Matilda Lloyd was graduated in the 1894 class. She was along with Ella Coleman and Margaret Miller. There were three women in the same class. They set two records there. One was the fact that they were most likely the very first graduates to receive a pharmacy degree, and the first time they had a class that had more than one woman in it. And so I tried to build a story on all three, and I'm still working on that because I cannot been able to find all the information on the other three women. I did find a little bit on Matilda Lloyd. She couldn't get a license, and that was not her fault. The same, I think, happened with Ella Coleman and Margaret Miller. As I mentioned before, women were blocked even though they had the degree. They oftentimes end up working as maids, cleaning up rooms, cleaning up hotels. And I had read that in another report by a historian, Dr. Rowe, out of University of Wisconsin, who I communicate with. He shared a lot of his research, and if you look up Ella Coleman and Margaret Miller, and one place to find their names would be on ancestry websites. It also shows their occupation, and it clearly shows that Ella Coleman was working as a maid in several of those citations. So and with a pharmacy degree, which means that she probably, I can't validate all that information, but I can tell you my suspicion is that women were still not being treated as a professional back that time because they wouldn't get hired, and sometimes they had to make a living, so they worked in different places. Paulie Morrow was one of the first women to set up a pharmacy in Victoria, Texas. Harriet Marble is another very well-known person from that school, and Molly Moon is another one who formed the National Urban League Guild, and those are their claim to fame. This is Harriet Marble, but I won't go into hers too much. She had a very beautiful career. She set up the first pharmacy in Lexington, Kentucky. One of the things that I was looking at today is that one newspaper article had her as being a sponsor of theater and music in the city of Lexington. So I thought she may have been a part owner of the Lyric Theater. That's a very famous theater where all the Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, all the big famous musicians performed there back in the early 1900s. And so, but I was able to actually find the ownership records for that theater, and her name does not appear on the incorporation records as being a part owner. But her drugstore was located in the same neighborhood right close to that theater. So I think that was probably why she had a relationship there. Molly Moon became a socialite in Manhattan. She gave up her pharmacy aspirations and spent most of her time as a socialite in that area. So Shaw Leonard was in Raleigh, North Carolina. It started around 1892. It was named after Justin Wade Leonard, who was the brother-in-law of the founder of the school, Mr. Henry Tupper. And so it had very small numbers, but it has very complete records. So this is another school where you can find all the records for the time that it was open, well, except for the last year. I have not been able to find that last year. So these are numbers that I've been able to compile from those records. So they were carrying about 36 or 34 students and only graduating about 4 or 5 per year out of their class. It also had a reputation for not admitting very many women. So in the whole time it was open, they only admitted 2 females. The first one there is Pearl Wassam, and the second one in 1909, that was Shelley Brown. And I've been trying to build their stories too, so I'm working on both of those stories. Pearl Wassam married and moved to Arizona, and that's about as far as I got with her. I can't figure what happened after that. And Shelley Brown, I'm completely lost on her. I can't get any much further on her at all. This is just they only had 2 women. This was the 1911 class, and I've written a book on this. The book will be coming out probably in about 2 weeks. But that photo you see there, I got approval from the university to put that on my cover. So that's the cover of the book that's coming out. University of West Tennessee was formed by a couple, B.B. Stevens Links and their husband Miles Links. And B.B. went back to school when they had the first class, and she was one in that 1900. Well, the class started in 1900 and it graduated in 1903. She was one of those 4 graduates in that class, and those are the 1902-3 records, and the 1909 are the only 2 records I've been able to get from the Library of Congress. That school was closed in 1923, and I have not been able to find those records for those years that's missing. That's in between the ones you see there. What I have been able to find is that from the ones that I have, there were 2 females in the first class. It was Willie Ann Stevens and B.B. Stevens. Willie Ann Stevens was B.B. Stevens' older sister. So her sister graduated with her. The sister ended up working as a school teacher because she could not get, for some reason, I haven't been able to learn why, that she could not work as a pharmacist. And then the lady that was in the 1923 class was W.E. Taylor, and I don't know what her initials stand for, but I've not been able to build a story on her yet either. So this is the photo of the last class that graduated. And up in the upper right corner, they had 4 graduates in that class that was in the pharmacy school. The others were dental. As you can see, there's only 2 in the medical school, which was the biggest program that they had. The reason that was the case, because by this time the medical school had lost its accreditation, where not accreditation, they have lost their integrity with the state. The state would not approve for the graduates in the medical school to take the board exam. So the medical school started to break up a few years before 1923, and they had started to recruit some Asian students to come in at the school, and they were, I'm assuming they graduated. I'm not sure whether they got the license or so. The significance about that photo, and you probably can't see it from the slide, but if you could enlarge that photo, under the lady in the center, underneath the husband, that's B.B. Stevens Links. What you will see there is that underneath her name is her position, and she was the dean. She was the dean of the school, and that's the only documentation I have of it. I tried to get the 1924 and the 1923, the 1922 and the 1921 records. I could get those records to see when did she get that appointment. But at that point, that made her the first African-American dean of a health science program in America who graduated from a pharmacy degree program. So that's the point I was going to make on this note on here, but I won't go through that for the sake of time. But the significance of her is that she was also one of the first female to serve on the faculty of a college of pharmacy and a college of medicine. She was on the faculty from 1903 to 1923, and she never gets mentioned. She never gets mentioned for that. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight her, because she deserved to be, the story needs to be told that she was the first, and they got a lot of other people claiming to be the first, but she technically was the first. And there was another lady who was the first right along with us at this school, at New Orleans University. Started in 1889 under the Flint Medical College. The pharmacy opened in 1900. It had 3 women in the class. This was the inaugural class, not the graduation class, but the first class. Lucy Gonzalez, Camille Green, and James Weathers. And the one that I want to point out here is Camille Green. So this school also had very complete records. I was able to get the records for every year that it was open. So these numbers are pretty close to being accurate. So they had their peak enrollment between 1911 and 1913. And so these are the women. So they had, the blue bars are just all women graduates. So they only had 2 in the first class. Several years went by where they had no women in the class. And then they began to admit some around 1910. And by the time they graduated, they had about 10 women that graduated from that school, and only about 50 graduates from that school total. I put this on because the faculty member on that school was Camille Green. She was a professor of pharmacy for 3 years at that university, and she started her professorship the same year as B.B. Stevens Link. So they were the first 2 African American to serve on a College of Pharmacy faculty. Also, Camille Green graduated with Minnie Moore. Minnie Moore was in the same class where they became the first 2 African American women in the state of Louisiana to graduate from a school in Louisiana with a pharmacy degree. And those are 2. And Minnie moved to Mississippi to start a pharmacy in Jackson, Mississippi. Louisville National Medical College were formed by 3 physicians. They had a pharmacy school that started in 1902, a very prestigious faculty, a very prestigious advisory board. Booker T. Washington was on that board. One of the presidents of one of the black schools was on that board. A number of very powerful people. It was one of those schools that what they call is the most likely to succeed, but they also fell prey to all the problems that was occurring with racism during that time. Again, this is one where I couldn't find the records. I worked with the National Library of Congress. We only found a few years of those records, and that's why you don't see the numbers in those spaces. I do know for sure they had 2 graduates, but there probably were more, and those are the only 2 that I can document. That was Jesse Merchant and Edward Morris that graduated from there. And they only had 1 faculty member that had a pharmacy training. The rest were all physicians. Frelinghuysen University was started in 1906, but the pharmacy school started in 1917. It was a very strict religious school that was named after Frederick Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was a U.S. senator who supported civil rights during the Senate in that time period, and they named the school after him. The school was also the first black chiropractic school. I don't think I know of any that even exists today. So that was pretty unique. Their biggest program was the law school. They graduated large numbers out of that law school. Pharmacy school was very small. I only have records of 1 class graduating from that school and 1 class that was starting. So, and that again is a limitation that I have in trying to find that data. Their faculty was made up of all Howard University graduates. William Jackson was a graduate of Howard. Dr. Spurlock was a graduate from the Howard Medical School. Dr. Harris was a graduate from the College of Pharmacy, and so was Dr. Smith. These are pretty well known names of people. If you look them up, you will see they got very accomplished records. So they had a pretty good, decent faculty, but the school had many financial problems that could not stay open. This is really just 1 year class, really. I don't want to mislead you like it's 4 years there. That's the same class. They had a same year, I'm sorry. So in that senior class only had 6 students in it. The second year class, which was like the sophomore class, had 2, and our freshman class had 11 graduates in it. I don't know whether they all graduated. I can't find proof to validate that. Out of that class, there was only 2 women out of that whole group of students, and that was in that first class. And one of them was the wife of the dean of the school in that first class. It lost its, the owner died. it was taken over by the very famous woman, Anna Cooper. If you look her up, she's a very famous lady, one of the first women to get a college degree in America. I would encourage you, if you have an interest, her argument to keep that school open is documented in the file. I would encourage you to look that up, because to read her case that she was making to the Board of Education to keep that school open is an emotional plea presented in such eloquence and with such, her speaking ability, her writing ability was just absolutely fascinating. I read it and I was convinced that they need to keep the school open just by reading her argument to keep it open. But lo and behold, the odds were against her, and the people did not want that school to be open, so they closed it down, and it eventually dissolved in 1950. I put these references here because these are some what I call flagship references on the history of African American pharmacists. The Negro in Pharmacy is one that I would encourage you to please take a look at that. That is such an eye opener. So then the second one is a pharmaceutical college profile, where they compared all the schools that were open up until at the year of 1897. There are two of the black schools that are in that comparison, which is Meharry and Shaw Leonard. And then there's an article by Leo Butts. He was the first African American graduate from the University of Wisconsin during the time when he had to write a thesis. So he wrote his thesis on the Negro in Pharmacy. There's no data in that document. It's a very good document that gives you an idea of what was going on, but he has no data. There's no data in those other two articles either. And then the book that was written, the book that was the Genesis of Black Pharmacists, that is out of print, and you have trouble finding that. I got that from Dr. Todd Savitt, who is a historian. He actually had a copy. He was nice enough to print it and give me a copy of that. The other one is Mozella Lewis. She was a student at Howard who did a thesis on the history of the Negro pharmacist. Now, the good thing about hers is that hers has the data in it. She has graduates in there that she was able to collect in her data. So that one, I would say, look at all of them. But one good thing about Mozella Lewis's study is that it has actual data of graduates in it. So she is at 1925 she received the Leonard Fink Award, which is the first African American to get that award, and it was given to her because of her study on the history of the Negro pharmacist, and it was published in 1925 in the American Druggist Journal. You can find that article. You can actually read it. So this is some of one of the tables she has in the article. She compared historically black schools data that she found against predominantly white school data. She looked at males and females before 1900 and males and females between 1900 and 1926, which is around the time she graduated. But what she found in her totals is that there were more black graduates from predominantly white schools during that time period than there were from historically black schools. So that's the data she found in the study, and that's this is one of the tables from her study. So what I did was I had already been collecting my own data. The blue bars you see is my data. The gray bars is her data. So and the first chart is the data from the predominantly white schools. And from 1894 to 1900, she didn't find any black graduates at the predominantly white school, and neither did I. So, but between 1900 and 1926, I found 48. She only found 13. I compared her data from 1927, and she didn't find any, but I found 18. And then totally, I found 66. This is at least a 2-year-old slide. I have not stopped looking at this. I look at it continuously. That number is somewhere around 80 graduates now. I found a lot more since I put this slide together. So being able to compare what she found to mine has been a helping me looking at this. So then I looked at the HBCUs. She only found that there was 2 graduates that were actually 10. And so that's why when I wrote an article the other day on the social media that there was only 10 graduates before 1900, I got every one of those. I can tell you who they were, where they came from, validated all their degrees. I have not been able to find any more than 10. So I'm fairly confident that we only had 10 African American females before 1900 that had a pharmacy degree. And then after that, the numbers started going up, and they're actually higher than what you see on this slide. So it's more than 200. This slide says 274 graduates in the far right bar, but it actually is more than that. And so where did they come from? These are the schools where I found them from. And Howard University had 76, but Harriet had 87 coming from their school. And the others, these are the historically black schools that are since closed. But no, except for Xavier and Howard, they're still there. But between that period of 1894 to 1940, Xavier was just getting started. So they had actually 18 women that graduated by 1940. And so that gave us a total of roughly 197. I double checked that, and I keep coming up with the same number. So we had about 197 women graduates between 1900 and 1940. And so when you see the study, you see all these reports now telling you that certain women are the first one ever in America. It truly is not correct. We probably had 10 to 30 women before most of the ones that are being told were the first. So it's not accurate. So these are some of the Howard graduates. I've been able to collect as much photos as I can. I've only got 2 that goes back before 1922, and I'm still looking to see if I can find more. This is Amanda Gray Hillier. I wanted to talk about her because she has a significance to Texas Southern University. That Amanda Gray was probably one of the most accomplished black female pharmacists. She graduated from Howard in 1903, but prior to coming to Howard, she had served she had been working in the school system. And she met Arthur Gray when he was also a student at the University of Kansas. And he didn't graduate. He stayed there 2 years and he left and went to Howard, and that's where he graduated from. One thing that's what I find so intriguing about this couple is that Arthur he was a singer. He loves to sing. In fact, he formed a glee club, and so did Amanda. They were both singers, and Amanda was known. I got all the newspaper clippings of her singing at the church and singing at funerals and singing at graduation ceremonies. I mean, she was a big singer, and so was Arthur. So it's kind of funny that the two got together and they have so much in common. And so that was pretty intriguing to me. Amanda had a nickname. She was from Atchison, Kansas. Hard to pronounce that word. And because she sang so much, her nickname was the Sweet Canary of Hilly Atkinson. And so that was put in one of their local newspapers, is where I got that from. Arthur was also an intramural sports figure. He loved to play sports. He did a lot of singing in his glee club. He was an artist. He loved sketching cartoons. Public speaking, could motivate a big crowd. He loves getting in front of crowds. He was a meeting organizer. So when he formed a number of clubs, and these clubs made him into one of those socialites in Washington D.C. area. So he and Amanda were very big people in the black circle during that time period. They were always involved. So he worked. He had a very big job during that time. He was a stenographer in the Bureau of Statistics. He also was a statistical writer. And because of that, he had to organize the schedules of a lot of big, important people in the government. So he became a meeting organizer. He threw a lot of parties and a lot of events that drew very big, high-class people to the events that he did. One of the people that came to Washington was Spurgeon Nathaniel Gray. Spurgeon is the younger brother, the youngest one in his family. He had 5 brothers: Edward, William, Arthur, Walter, and Frankie, and the youngest one was Spurgeon. And so Spurgeon met Arthur in Washington, D.C. for a while, and they actually, I put down his interest as being sports music and singing along with his brother, and I don't know that to be a fact, but what I do know is that when you look at the newspaper clippings of the parties that that Arthur threw, they always had a guest list, and Spurgeon's name appears on several of those guest lists. So if he wasn't singing with them and participating with them, he was actually there at many of those events. As you know, he's very well known in Texas, and the Spurgeon Gray Hall was dedicated about 4 years after he died, and he had a pharmacy that served a lot of the underserved patient populations throughout Beaumont and some other parts of Texas. So, and he was a 1987 graduate from the University of Kansas and the first pharmacist. I didn't tell you here, but Arthur was not a pharmacist at first. He and his wife opened up a drugstore, and he later went back to Howard and got his PharmD degree back in 1910. So he became a pharmacist after his brother Spurgeon. So when Spurgeon was in Washington, D.C., Amanda opened Fountain Pharmacy, and that pharmacy was opened by her and Arthur. They formed a corporation called Gray and Gray, and that Gray and Gray, I don't know if it means Amanda Gray and Arthur Gray, or if it means Amanda Gray, Arthur Gray, and Spurgeon Gray. Because if you look at the photo to the left, there's three people in that photo, and that's Amanda is the lady in the middle, Arthur's to the left, and that's Spurgeon Gray on the right. They published the very first medical directory. What that is a directory of all the healthcare professionals in the city of Washington, D.C. They opened Fountain Pharmacy in the first floor of the True Reformers Hall that you see on the right, and that's where the pharmacy was located. But that building was a very, very famous building. That second floor was a dance hall where blacks went to for entertainment on weekends and other special events. It's also the place where the first big jazz musicians started to get their start. That's where Duke Ellington got his start, on the second floor of that building, performing there. And after he made that performance, that building, that second floor, became a place where a lot of famous musicians went right underneath their store. So when what the other significance about the Gray family was that Gray and Gray Enterprise not only had a pharmacy there, but they also had in that same building a post office branch station that they created. They also sold African American colored dolls, which was the only place in the city that sold them during the time. Since most of the news came through newspapers, they were also a distributor of two of the major black newspapers, which was the New York Age and the Washington Bee. And they also had a telegraph office there and a laundry service that they opened up as well. So they were a very, very busy family. Arthur died in 1917 at a very young age, and Andrew Hillier, who was a friend of the family, he and his wife and Arthur and Amanda used to spend a lot of time together. They also were part of these same social clubs. Andrew Hillier's wife died. Amanda's husband, Arthur, died. And Amanda closed the pharmacy, moved to Missouri, came back to Washington, D.C., around the time that Andrew's wife died. And lo and behold, the two got together and they got married. So now she became Amanda Gray Hillier up until the time she died. And then Andrew died 3 years after they got married. One of the things there are two famous people on there, two well-known folks on the slide. That's Virginia Washington and Minnie Cruz, and they were students under Amanda Gray Hillier, who used to work in their stores, and they later became big, well-known people. These are some of the data that I collected in the schools that they came from. For the sake of time, I won't really go to each one of them, but the school that had some big numbers were University of Pittsburgh. They graduated at least 10 African-American females between 1894 and 1940. And the other big one was Temple University. They had up to 28 African-American women graduated from that school. And the others numbers were a little smaller. Massachusetts College of Pharmacy, that number is probably not correct. I think they may have had more than 5, but the others only had much smaller numbers, which is like 1 to 5 graduates from those schools. University of Kansas, I've only been able to find one, and that was Ada Perel Bell, who graduated in 1916. And I went even years after that, up until about 1930, and I can't find any. So that's probably where I'm going to stay with that for now. these are some of the women I've been able to collect photos on from Temple. It's a lot more than what you see here, but I just didn't want to put all that together. So what I found is that there were 7 schools, 6 out of the 7 schools evolved from, no, that's not correct, it's 4. 4 out of the 7 schools evolved from the African American medical schools. And out of those 9 schools that were open, they issued out over 700 diplomas to African Americans for the first time in America. The HBCU school, which was, in this case, was Mahari, graduated one of the largest classes ever, which they had 43 students in that one class, and that was a historical record. They all had differences, but for the most part, they were very, very similar, and they all faced the same difficulties in trying to stay open, and so they all sort of closed under the same type of constraints. And I won't go through much more than I had a few summary statements, but I'll leave those alone. And at this point, I will welcome, I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome any comments and discussion that you may have. I wanted to tell you, I've put a plug in, I got a book coming out with all this data in it, and it's being held up by the publisher. Hopefully I'll get this thing out really soon. My dean is beating my head down for not getting it out. It should have came out back about November, but it will be out sometime in March, I believe, and you should be able to see most of the stuff that I just shared with you today in a lot more detail. So at this point, I will end it. I will stop here. I would welcome any questions and any comments, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can kind of see each other.
Dr. Clark, thank you so much. That was one of the most informative lectures, sir, that I have heard in a long time. That was absolutely great, amazing. Thank you so much. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about the mission that all of us in academia have when we decide to be in an academic setting. And I think that mission is contribution to the expansion of current knowledge. And I can tell you that you have fulfilled that mission, sir. That was an amazing presentation. I look forward to reading your book. I'm hoping that you send me a couple of autographed copies. That would be great. Indeed.
I'll see you. I will. I'll certainly do that.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in our future pharmacy meetings. We have one question in the chat for you this evening, sir. That comes from Dr. Milton. I'm sure you know Dr. Milton well.
Sure. Very well.
Here's the question from Dr. Milton. It reads, do you think the change in pharmacy fraternities like Kappa Psi to become a co-ed has been a positive or negative influence on addressing the needs of women in pharmacy?
I have mixed feelings about that. I think it probably is a right thing to do, but I find that women did probably accomplish more when they were able to work together. I think that work as a team. So I do believe that the right thing to do is to have the diversity and inclusion like we're striving for now. But I'm not so sure whether we're going to achieve the things and meet the needs that everyone have in that manner. And I say that because of how, from a historical perspective, I can remember, if you look at the data on the women's movement and how we had a what they call the colored women movement, and then we had the other movement. And because somehow there always becomes when they finally lay their agenda out for strategic planning and try to put something together, you run into these differences. To the difference to the point that they can't achieve what they want to do as a group. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. I think that it's possible, and I hope that it can occur, but it leaves you with some suspicion that it may not. But it would be one of those things that I think it's going to take some time to really see how it comes. It depends a lot on leadership. how they're leading the organization to make sure that they can maintain that diversity and inclusion and be able to meet certain mission and vision and goals that their organization have for everyone? That's a good question. I mean, that's a good question for a debate and a lot of debate back and forth. So that's my take on it. I try to make sure I can find a way to validate my comments, but sometimes you have to express your opinion without data.
So once again, Dr. Clark, with my sincere gratitude to you for your presentation, I certainly hope that here at TSU with you, we can continue this discussion and have you back, invite you back to come visit us virtually or hopefully soon enough in person, and be back at your alma mater for more presentations and discussions on this topic. It was truly fascinating. I appreciate your efforts again tonight. I want to thank all of those folks who attended your seminar this evening, and with that, again, thank you everybody. Thank you, Dr. Clark, and wishing everybody a great evening.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Blessings to you, sir. Thank you. Have a great evening.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.